The kitchen table in the Brennan house had witnessed more of their marriage than any church or courthouse ever could. Scratched oak worn smooth by 60 years of elbows, coffee cups, homework assignments, and the weight of 10,000 small decisions that somehow shaped entire lives. Walter Brennan, 72 years old with hands like weathered leather and shoulders that still carried the memory of 4 decades swinging hammers, sat across from his wife Ruth, 68, silver hair pulled back in the same simple bun she'd worn since her first day teaching 3rd grade back in 1976. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Between them lay something absurdly out of place on that ancient table. A laptop, barely 2 years old, a gift from their daughter Rebecca, who worried they were becoming too isolated, too disconnected from the modern world. The screen glowed with a property listing that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. $23,000, Ruth said for the 4th time that morning, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd perfected over 3 decades in the classroom. The one that said something was either too good to be true or someone was trying to pull a fast one. In her experience, those two things usually amounted to the same thing. Walter leaned closer, squinting at the screen. His reading glasses had vanished again, probably left in the garage next to whatever carburetor or lawnmower engine he'd been tinkering with since dawn. At 72, he still couldn't sit still, still needed his hands busy, still needed to be fixing something even though his body complained more with each passing year. "Says it's a stone house," he read slowly, scrolling down with the caution of someone who'd only started using computers when their grandchildren showed them how. Built in 1809, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, mountain views, original construction mostly intact. He paused, reading ahead silently. Says it needs work, but the structure's sound, foundations solid. Roof was replaced in 1998. In Switzerland, Ruth added, as if he might have somehow missed that rather important geographical detail. "Walter, we've never even been to Europe. We've barely been out of Pennsylvania except for that one trip to Florida when your mother was sick." He sat back in his chair, and the wood creaked in that familiar way it had been creaking for 47 years, a sound as much a part of their marriage as their wedding vows. Outside their small ranch house on Maple Street, autumn was settling into Millbrook like an old friend coming home. Gold leaves scattered across their modest yard, the air carried that particular October smell of wood smoke and apples, and somewhere down the street a dog barked with the lazy enthusiasm of a creature who knew it was too nice a day to be truly upset about anything. They'd lived in this town their entire adult lives. Raised 3 children here, Thomas, Margaret, and Rebecca, in this very house with its sagging front porch and temperamental furnace and windows that leaked cold air every winter no matter how much weather stripping Walter applied. They'd buried both sets of parents in the cemetery on Hollow Road, the one with the iron gates and the oak tree so old it had been there when the town was founded. Their roots went so deep in this Pennsylvania soil that the idea of pulling them up, especially now, especially at their age, felt both terrifying and strangely, unexpectedly thrilling. "Let me see the numbers again," Walter said, reaching for the yellow legal pad where Ruth had been doing calculations in her precise teacher's handwriting. She pushed it across the table. The numbers told a story they both knew by heart, but hated to read aloud. After selling Walter's old truck, the 1995 Ford that had finally given up the ghost last spring, and the woodworking equipment he'd accumulated over 40 years but could no longer safely use because of his trembling hands and failing eyesight, they had approximately $34,700 in savings. Their house was paid off, thank God. The mortgage had been satisfied 3 years ago, and they'd celebrated with a bottle of cheap champagne and tears of relief. But the house itself was falling apart. The roof needed replacing again. The furnace made sounds that suggested it was one hard winter away from catastrophic failure. The electrical system was original to 1957 and probably violated every code that had been written since. Property taxes kept climbing even as their fixed incomes stayed frozen. Insurance premiums increased every year. And then there was the simple arithmetic of getting old. Walter's blood pressure medication cost $83 a month, even with Medicare. Ruth's arthritis required treatments that insurance only partially covered. They'd had to replace the water heater last year and the refrigerator the year before that. Every car repair felt like a financial crisis. Every unexpected expense, and at their age, everything was unexpected, meant choosing between prescriptions and groceries, between heat and electricity, between dignity and desperation. "We've got maybe 5 more years in this house," Walter said quietly, stating what they both knew. "Maybe less. Then what? Move in with one of the kids? They've all offered, God bless them, but you know how that'd go." Ruth knew exactly how it would go. Thomas lived in a tiny apartment in Philadelphia with 2 roommates despite being 43 years old. Margaret had 3 children under 10 and a husband who traveled for work, leaving her managing chaos on a daily basis. Rebecca had the space, but also had a mother-in-law already living in her basement apartment, and the tension between those 2 generations was already thick enough to cut with a knife. "Or we end up in one of those places," Ruth said, not needing to specify what places she meant. They'd visited enough friends in nursing homes to know. Shared rooms, institutional food, the slow erosion of independence and dignity, lives reduced to waiting for visiting hours and wondering if anyone would remember to come. "We worked 50 years, Walter said, and there was something in his voice Ruth hadn't heard in a long time. Not anger exactly, frustration. Disappointment. "I built houses for other people my entire career. Beautiful houses. Houses with proper insulation and modern wiring and kitchens that didn't leak when it rained. And we've got $34,000 and a house that's falling down around us." Ruth reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her fingers, once smooth from nothing more than chalk dust and children's sticky hands, were now gnarled with arthritis, marked by age spots and years of working in her small garden, the only luxury she'd allowed herself. The rings on her finger, the simple gold band from their wedding and the tiny diamond engagement ring that Walter had saved 6 months to afford, caught the morning light. "We did raise 3 good people," she said gently. "That counts for something." "It counts for everything," Walter agreed, turning his hand over to interlace their fingers. "But it doesn't pay for new furnaces or keep us from being a burden on them when we can't take care of ourselves anymore." They sat in silence for a moment, the kitchen clock ticking, the refrigerator humming its labored hum, the house settling around them with all its creaks and groans and familiar complaints. Then Ruth pulled the laptop closer and read the listing again. This time out loud, slowly, as if hearing the words might make them make more sense. "Estate sale. Urgent disposition required. Stone house circa 1809 in the Swiss Alps near the village of Grindelwald. 3 bedrooms, stone construction, original features. Property has been vacant for 6 years following owner's death. No heirs. Estate administration seeking quick sale. Property sold as is. Serious inquiries only. Starting price, $23,000 US or best offer." Walter leaned back and stared at the ceiling, at the water stain that had been there since 2008 when the roof had leaked during that bad ice storm. He did the math in his head, the way he'd done math his entire life, measuring boards, calculating angles, estimating costs. "If we sold this house," he said slowly, "even in the shape it's in, we'd probably get 80, maybe 90,000 for it. Millbrook's been growing. Young families moving in. It's not much, but it's something." "And then what?" Ruth asked. "Use that money and what we've saved to buy some falling-down house in Switzerland that we've never seen? That could be a complete disaster? That we'd have to maintain and heat and somehow live in when we don't speak German and don't know anyone and are 72 and 68 years old?" "Yes," Walter said simply. "Exactly that." Ruth stared at him. "You're serious?" "Ruth, what do we have to lose?" If we stay here, we've got 5 years until this house defeats us, or we run out of money, or both. We move in with one of the kids and become the elderly parents they have to work their schedules around, have to worry about, have to eventually put somewhere when we need more care than they can provide." He leaned forward, and his eyes, still sharp despite his need for reading glasses, still that particular blue that had made her heart skip when she was 19 years old, held hers. "Or we take whatever time we have left and do something completely, absolutely, ridiculously unreasonable. We buy a house in the mountains. We figure out how to live there. We spend our last years looking at something beautiful instead of waiting for the furnace to die. We could end up broke and homeless in a foreign country," Ruth pointed out. "We're going to end up broke anyway," Walter countered. "At least this way we'd have a hell of a story." That evening, after Ruth had made dinner, chicken and rice, stretched to include enough leftovers for tomorrow because that's how she'd cooked for 50 years and couldn't stop now even though it was just the two of them, they called their children for what they described as a family conference. Thomas joined via video call from Philadelphia, his face appearing on the laptop screen looking tired and skeptical. Margaret called on the phone, her voice competing with the sounds of children arguing in the background. Rebecca drove over in person, arriving with that particular expression of concern that suggested she thought this meeting was going to be about illness or death or some other crisis that adult children of elderly parents always quietly dreaded. "We're moving to Switzerland," Walter announced once everyone was connected and settled. "We're buying a house in the mountains and we're going to live there." The silence that followed was profound. Then all 3 children started talking at once. "Dad, have you lost your mind?" That was Thomas. "Mom, is this a joke? Is this some kind of early onset?" Margaret caught herself before finishing that sentence, but everyone knew where it had been heading. Rebecca, sitting at their kitchen table, just stared at them. "You're serious. Oh my God, you're actually serious." For the next 2 hours they argued. The children presented every logical reason why this was a terrible idea. They were too old. They didn't speak the language. They'd never been to Europe. What about health care? What about emergencies? What about staying close to family? What if the house was a scam? What if it was falling apart? What if they got there and hated it? What if they got sick? What if? Walter and Ruth listened patiently to all of it. Then Ruth, in the voice she'd used to quiet rowdy classrooms for 36 years, said simply, "We've made our decision. We're telling you as a courtesy because we love you, not because we're asking permission. We spent our whole lives being responsible, being practical, doing the sensible thing, and now we're going to do something impractical and possibly foolish because we're tired of being sensible and we don't have much time left to be anything else." "But," Margaret started. "No," Ruth interrupted gently but firmly. "No buts. We're going. You can support us or you can worry about us, but we're going either way. The only question is whether you'll wish us well or spend whatever time we have left being angry that we didn't live our final years the way you thought we should." That ended the debate, not because the children agreed, they most certainly did not, but because they recognized that tone in their mother's voice. The one that meant the discussion was over, the decision was made, and no amount of arguing would change anything. 2 weeks later, Walter and Ruth sat in a lawyer's office in downtown Millbrook, signing papers that sold the only house they'd ever owned. The young lawyer, barely 30, kept asking if they were sure, if they understood they were selling their primary residence, if they had a plan for where they'd live. "We have a plan," Walter assured him. "It might be a stupid plan, but it's ours." The house sold for $87,500 to a young couple expecting their first child, who loved the neighborhood and saw potential where Walter and Ruth only saw decay. The closing was bittersweet. Walking out of that house for the last time, knowing they'd never return, that someone else would sleep in their bedroom and cook in their kitchen and plant new flowers where Ruth's roses had grown for 40 years, it hurt in ways they hadn't expected, but it also felt like freedom. They stored what little they wanted to keep: photograph albums, Ruth's mother's china, Walter's father's war medals, in Rebecca's garage. Everything else they sold or donated. Furniture that had seen them through decades of life, gone. Books they'd collected, gone. The accumulated possessions of 50 years together, reduced to a dozen boxes and whatever would fit in 2 suitcases. "Feels like we're erasing ourselves," Ruth said on their last night in America, staying in Rebecca's guest room, surrounded by suitcases and uncertainty. "Feels like we're starting over," Walter countered. "How many people get to start over at 72? The flight to Zurich was Walter's first time in an airplane since he'd been drafted in 1971 and flown to boot camp. Ruth had never flown at all. They'd booked economy seats because that's what they could afford, and they held hands during takeoff like teenagers, 2 elderly people experiencing something millions did every day, but which felt to them like stepping off the edge of the known world and trusting in the improbable. Ruth didn't sleep during the flight. She watched the darkness outside the window, the occasional lights of cities far below, and wondered what the hell they were doing. At 68 years old, she should be planning a garden, not moving to a foreign country. She should be volunteering at the library, teaching kids to read, living a quiet life surrounded by familiarity and routine. Instead, she was flying through the night toward a country she'd never seen, toward a house she'd purchased based on 6 photographs and a poorly translated property description, toward a future that was utterly, completely uncertain. It was terrifying. It was also the most alive she'd felt in 20 years. They landed in Zurich at dawn. The airport was clean, efficient, and completely overwhelming. Signs in German, French, and English. People moving with purpose and precision. Everything felt foreign, from the bathroom fixtures to the money to the way coffee was served. They'd hired a car service to drive them to the house, too nervous to attempt driving themselves in a foreign country on unfamiliar roads. The driver, a quiet man named Klaus, who looked to be in his 50s, helped them load their 2 suitcases and a box of basic supplies they'd brought from America. Then he programmed the GPS and pulled out into Swiss traffic, while Walter and Ruth sat in the back seat, watching Switzerland unfold through rain-streaked windows. The drive took 4.5 hours. They left the city behind, the urban landscape giving way to towns, then villages, then countryside that looked like something from a storybook. Rolling hills gave way to steeper terrain. Mountains began to emerge from the morning mist, first as distant shapes, then as towering presences that made Pennsylvania's modest hills seem like gentle suggestions. They climbed higher. The road narrowed from highway to 2-lane road to something barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. Villages clung to mountainsides in defiance of gravity and common sense. Stone houses with steep roofs. Wooden chalets with flower boxes still blooming in late October. Church steeples pointing toward skies that seemed simultaneously close enough to touch and infinitely distant. "It's beautiful," Ruth whispered, her face pressed to the window like a child. "It's terrifying," Walter admitted, watching the road wind higher and higher, the valley dropping away below them in a way that made his stomach clench. Klaus, who'd said perhaps 20 words the entire trip, glanced at them in the rearview mirror. "The house you buy," he said in heavily accented English. "It has been empty long time, many years. People in the village, they wonder why no one wants it, why it sits alone." "Do you know why?" Walter asked, a cold feeling creeping up his spine. Klaus shrugged. "Old stories. Old houses have old stories. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. Swiss people, we do not like houses with questions." "What kind of questions?" Ruth pressed, but Klaus just shook his head and returned his attention to the road, which had become little more than a gravel track climbing through pine forest. They emerged from the trees into a clearing, and there it was. The house sat on a hillside like it had grown there, like it was as much a part of the mountain as the rock and trees around it. Massive blocks of gray stone fitted together with the kind of precision that spoke of old craftsmanship and old secrets. 3 stories tall with small windows and heavy shutters. A steep pitched roof designed for snow loads that would crush lesser buildings. A wooden door bound with iron that looked like it could withstand a siege. Beautiful, ancient, imposing, and utterly, completely alone. Below them, the valley spread out in shades of green and gray and the silver thread of a distant river. Other houses were visible, but far away, isolated pinpricks of habitation separated by forest and stone and distance. The nearest neighbor was at least 2 miles down the mountain. The nearest village, a handful of buildings clustered around a church, was 40 minutes by car. Klaus helped them unload their suitcases, accepted his payment, and hesitated before leaving. He looked at the house, then at them, then back at the house. "You are sure?" he asked. "You want to stay here?" "We're sure," Walter said with more confidence than he felt. Klaus shrugged again, that universal gesture of people who'd said their piece and washed their hands of responsibility. "Good luck," he said, and left before they could ask what exactly they'd need luck for. They stood alone in the dirt driveway, the sound of Klaus's car fading down the mountain, replaced by wind through pine trees and the distant clanging of cowbells from somewhere unseen. The silence was profound in a way that city people or even small-town people never quite experienced. Not just quiet, but the absence of the constant low hum of civilization. No traffic, no sirens, no voices, just wind and birds and the creaking of old trees. "Well," Walter said, pulling the heavy iron key from his pocket. It was old-fashioned, the kind of key that belonged in fairy tales, all elaborate teeth and substantial weight. "Shall we see what we bought?" Ruth took his arm. Whether for support or courage or simply connection, neither of them could say. They walked up the stone path together, their footsteps echoing in the mountain stillness, each step taking them further from everything they'd known and closer to something utterly unknown. The key turned in the lock with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for them. The door swung inward with a groan that sounded almost alive, almost like a warning. They stepped inside. The interior was dark, cool, and smelled of stone and time and something else. Something like absence, as if the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting. Walter fumbled along the wall until he found a light switch. Single bulbs hanging from old fixtures flickered on, throwing shadows across walls that were at least 2 feet thick, across floors of stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its opening large enough that Walter could have stood inside it. The hearth was blackened by countless fires, and above it hung an iron pot on a chain, suggesting centuries of meals cooked over open flames. Furniture sat beneath white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Everything was clean, surprisingly immaculately clean, but it felt untouched, preserved rather than lived in, like a museum display of how people used to live rather than an actual home. They moved through the rooms slowly, speaking in whispers without knowing why. The kitchen was outdated by American standards, appliances from the 1980s at the newest, a sink that was little more than a stone basin with a single tap, but it was functional. The main living area was spare, almost monastic, with narrow windows that let in limited light but framed views of the valley that took Ruth's breath away. Upstairs, they found 3 bedrooms, each one simple to the point of severity. Narrow beds with plain wooden frames, simple furniture, no decorations beyond the stone walls themselves and the ancient wooden beams that supported the ceiling. "It's like a monastery," Ruth said, running her hand along the wall of what would become their bedroom. The stone was cold to the touch, but solid, enduring. This house had stood for over 200 years through wars and storms and the changing seasons of 2 centuries. It would stand long after they were gone. "The realtor said the previous owner died 6 years ago," Walter said, examining the window. It had bars on the inside, disguised as decorative ironwork but unmistakably functional. "No family, no heirs. The estate's been trying to sell it ever since." 6 years, Ruth repeated, looking around the pristine room. "And yet everything's clean. Someone's been taking care of it. That was the first oddity they noticed. Not dirt or decay or the accumulated grime of years of abandonment, but the opposite. Fresh air, as if windows had been opened regularly. No dust beyond the lightest coating, no signs of animals or insects or any of the usual indicators of a building left empty. The second oddity came when they explored the basement. They found the stairs descending from the kitchen, tucked behind a door they'd initially thought was a pantry. Steep stone steps leading down into darkness. Walter went first, using his phone as a flashlight, Ruth close behind, each step careful because their balance wasn't what it had been 40 years ago, and a fall here, in this house with no neighbors and no nearby hospital, could be catastrophic. The basement was vast, running the entire length of the house. Support pillars rose like ancient trees, their stone bases wider than Walter's arm span. The ceiling was low enough that he had to duck in places, his 6'2" frame not built for centuries-old architecture designed for shorter people. The floor was stone, uneven but solid, and everything was dry, surprisingly, impossibly dry for a basement carved into a mountainside. That's when Walter noticed the walls. Most of the basement had walls that matched the house, thick stone blocks, mortared with materials that had hardened over centuries, showing their age in the way old things do. But at the far end, barely visible in the dim light, was a section that looked different. Newer stone, different mortar, fitted together more roughly, as if it had been done quickly or by someone less skilled. He walked toward it slowly, Ruth following, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The wall was perhaps 10 feet wide and 8 feet high, clearly added long after the original construction. And in the center, hidden behind a wooden cabinet that sat flush against the stone, was a seam. Not a crack from settling or age. A seam, straight, intentional, deliberate. "Walter," Ruth said quietly, "what is that?" He pushed the cabinet. It moved easily, far too easily for something that appeared heavy and ancient. It slid aside on hidden wheels, revealing the seam more clearly. It outlined a door. A sealed door, mortared shut with cement that had aged but not to match the 200-year-old stone around it. This was 50 years old, maybe 60. Recent by the standards of this house. Walter ran his hands over the surface, his contractor's instincts activated despite retirement. He felt for weakness, for gaps, for any indication of what might lie beyond. The wall was solid, professional. Someone had sealed this with the clear intention that it should stay sealed. Someone had hidden something behind tons of stone and mortar, then disguised it with a cabinet and hoped no one would look too closely. "We should probably leave it alone," Ruth said. But there was no conviction in her voice, no real belief that leaving it alone was what they were going to do. They'd already come too far for should and probably. "Or," Walter said slowly, still running his hands over the sealed entrance, feeling the workmanship, reading the story written in stone and mortar, "we could find out why someone went to this much trouble to hide whatever's back there." They spent that night in the house, sleeping fitfully in the narrow bed in what was now their bedroom, listening to unfamiliar sounds. The wind moved differently through mountain valleys than Pennsylvania suburbs. Wood creaked and settled in rhythms they didn't recognize. At some point in the darkness, Ruth whispered, "Are we insane? Did we really spend our life savings to move to a foreign country and buy a house with a sealed wall in the basement?" "Probably," Walter whispered back. "But we're insane together, and that's what matters." The next morning, Walter drove their newly rented car, a small European model that felt like a toy compared to his old truck, down to the nearest town. The hardware store was easy to find, one of only a dozen buildings clustered around the village square. The shopkeeper, an older man with weathered features and suspicious eyes, watched as Walter selected a sledgehammer, safety goggles, work gloves, and a pry bar. When Walter brought them to the counter, the shopkeeper said something in German that Walter didn't understand. Then, seeing the confusion on Walter's face, he switched to heavily accented English. You are the American who bought Vogel House? Yes, Walter confirmed. We just arrived. The shopkeeper looked at the tools Walter was buying, then back at Walter's face. Be careful, he said. Vogel House has been quiet long time. Maybe some things should stay quiet. What do you mean? Walter asked. But the shopkeeper just shook his head, rang up the purchase, and accepted Walter's unfamiliar Swiss francs without further comment. On the drive back up the mountain, Walter thought about that warning, about Klaus's reluctance, about the 6 years the house had sat empty, about the pristine condition despite abandonment, about the sealed wall. When he got back to the house, he found Ruth in the basement, standing in front of the wall, a flashlight in her hand. I've been thinking about this all morning, she said, about why someone would seal up part of their basement, about what could possibly be back there that required hiding. Could be anything, Walter said. Could be structural, could be water damage, could be absolutely nothing. Or, Ruth said, turning to look at him, it could be something that explains why no one else wanted this house, why it sat empty for 6 years, why people gave us warnings. Walter set down the tools he'd bought. Last chance to walk away, he said. We could leave it sealed. We could pretend we never noticed. We could live here and never know what's behind that wall. Could we? Ruth asked. Could you? Honestly? He thought about that. About spending whatever years they had left in this house, always wondering, always aware of the sealed door in the basement, always questioning. No, he admitted. I couldn't. Neither could I, Ruth said. They stood there for a moment, 2 elderly people in a basement in Switzerland, confronting a decision that felt larger than it should. Then Walter picked up the sledgehammer. Then I guess we're doing this, he said. He positioned himself in front of the wall, feeling the weight of the tool in his hands. 72 years old. Hands that shook slightly, back that ached, but arms that had swung hammers for 40 years and still remembered how. Ruth stood behind him, holding the flashlight steady, her other hand pressed to her heart as if trying to calm its racing. Ready? Walter asked. No, Ruth said, but do it anyway. The first swing echoed through the basement like thunder. Ancient mortar cracked. The second swing widened the cracks, sending dust and small chunks of cement falling. By the 10th swing, Walter's arms burned and his breathing was labored. By the 20th, there was a hole large enough to see through. He stopped, chest heaving, sweat running down his face despite the basement's chill. He wasn't 25 anymore. He wasn't even 50. But he'd started this, and by God, he'd finish it. Ruth stepped forward with the flashlight, directing its beam through the opening they'd created. They both froze. Beyond the broken wall wasn't another room. It wasn't a storage space or a wine cellar or any of the ordinary things you'd expect to find in an old house's basement. It was something else entirely. The flashlight beam caught steel, stone, the glint of metal, rows upon rows of something stretching back into darkness. The space beyond was enormous, carved deep into the mountain itself, supported by steel beams that had no business being in a house built in 1809. This was a vault, a massive, purpose-built vault, and it was full. Ruth's hand trembled, sending the flashlight beam dancing crazily across surfaces they couldn't quite comprehend. Gold? No, that couldn't be right. But the color, the weight-looking density of the stacked bars. Oh my God, she whispered. Walter, oh my God, what is this? Walter didn't answer, couldn't answer. He was staring through the opening at wooden crates marked with dates from the 1940s, at filing cabinets that stretched along one wall, at shelves holding objects they couldn't identify from this distance, at a space that shouldn't exist, filled with things that couldn't be real. Above them, on the wall just visible through the opening, hung a large framed photograph. A man in his 50s, stern-faced and dignified, standing in front of this very house. Below the photograph, even in the dim light, Walter could make out a brass plaque with words engraved in German. His phone was in his pocket. His hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to pull it out and take a picture of the plaque. Later, much later, he'd use a translation app to read the words. But in this moment, standing in the broken entrance to a vault that held secrets they couldn't begin to understand, Walter Brennan had only one coherent thought. What in God's name have we bought? What have we stumbled into? And what are we supposed to do now? The answer to those questions would change their lives, challenge everything they thought they knew about courage and integrity, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most extraordinary adventures begin with the simplest decisions: to be curious, to be brave, and to believe that even at 72 years old there are still discoveries worth making and truths worth protecting. But for now, in this moment, they simply stood in the darkness of their Swiss mountain basement, staring through broken stone at impossible wealth and unknown secrets. 2 elderly people who'd thought they were buying a quiet retirement house and instead had purchased something far more valuable and far more dangerous, a responsibility that would define the rest of their lives. They didn't sleep that night. How could they? 2 elderly people who'd spent their entire lives following rules, paying taxes on time, returning extra change when cashiers made mistakes, and never taking anything that wasn't rightfully theirs, had just broken through a wall and discovered something that belonged in movies, not in their retirement. Walter and Ruth sat at the scarred wooden table in the kitchen, a bottle of Swiss wine between them. Neither of them usually drank, but circumstances had shifted somewhat, and a notebook where Ruth had begun writing down everything they'd seen through that opening. Her teacher's training demanded organization even in chaos, especially in chaos. "We need to go back down there," Walter said for the 3rd time, staring at the ceiling as if he could see through 2 floors of stone to the basement below. "We need to understand what we're looking at." "It's past midnight," Ruth replied, but she was already standing, already reaching for the flashlight they'd left by the door. They descended the stairs together, moving carefully in the darkness. Walter's knees complained about each step. Ruth gripped the railing with both hands, her arthritic fingers protesting. They were too old for midnight adventures in dark basements. They were too old for a lot of things they'd done in the past 24 hours. At the bottom of the stairs, the broken wall gaped like a wound in the stone. Walter had widened the opening before they'd stopped for the night, creating a space large enough to climb through without crouching. He'd worked for 2 hours, methodical despite his exhaustion, removing enough stone and mortar to make passage safe. Now that opening beckoned, promising answers and questions in equal measure. Walter went first, flashlight held high, Ruth close behind. They stepped through the opening and into the vault. The space was massive, at least 40 feet deep and 30 feet wide, carved directly into the mountain bedrock and reinforced with steel beams that spoke of engineering far beyond what an 1809 farmhouse should possess. Someone had excavated this space, probably in the middle of the 20th century based on the construction methods, and done so with secrecy and serious resources. The ceiling was perhaps 8 feet high, lower than modern standards but adequate. The walls were a combination of natural rock and poured concrete, sealed and dry despite being underground in a mountain that surely saw significant moisture. Industrial-grade dehumidifiers sat in each corner, their electrical cords running to outlets that suggested this space had power separate from the main house. Someone had maintained this vault recently, but it was the contents that made Walter's breath catch and Ruth's hand find his arm for support. Along the left wall, stacked on reinforced metal shelving from floor to ceiling, were gold bars. Not a few bars hidden away as personal insurance, but rows upon rows of them. Each bar was stamped with markings, Swiss refineries, date codes, serial numbers, weight specifications, 25 pounds each approximately. Walter counted quickly, his contractor's mind automatically calculating 15 shelves, roughly 15 bars per shelf, multiple sections. Over 200 bars, he said aloud, his voice sounding strange in the enclosed space. Jesus, Ruth, that's over 5,000 pounds of gold. Ruth was staring at a different section. Here, in climate-controlled cabinets with glass doors, were paintings. Not prints or reproductions, but original works in ornate frames. Even with her limited art knowledge, Ruth recognized some of the styles. Impressionist works with their soft light and color. A portrait in the style of the old masters, all dark oils and careful detail. A landscape that made her think of the postcards she'd seen of the French countryside. Each painting was accompanied by a small card noting the artist, date, and a series of numbers she didn't understand. In the center of the vault stood a massive steel table, and on it were stacks of documents in protective plastic sleeves. Bearer bonds, Ruth realized, reading the ornate script on the top document. She'd learned about these in an economics class decades ago, financial instruments that belonged to whoever held them, with no names attached, no registration, no way to track ownership. They'd been popular before modern banking regulations because they were essentially anonymous wealth. This one, yellowed with age but preserved in its protective sleeve, was made out for $10 million and dated 1946. Walter was examining another section now, wooden crates marked with stamps and dates. He pried one open carefully, the old nails protesting but giving way. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them for decades, were stacks of currency. Swiss francs, German marks, American dollars, British pounds, French francs. All of it old, some of it probably valuable to collectors beyond its face value. All of it organized with meticulous care. Each bundle was labeled with a date and a series of numbers that suggested a catalog system. "This isn't random," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the surreal nature of what they were witnessing. "This is organized, documented. Someone kept records of all of this." She was right. As they explored further, they found filing cabinets, 6 of them, tall industrial units that looked impervious to time and decay. Walter opened the first drawer. Inside were hanging files, each one labeled in precise handwriting, each one containing documents that made his head spin. Bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, receipts for purchases of jewelry, art, and securities, correspondence between banks and clients. All of it dated from the 1930s and 40s, all of it written in multiple languages, all of it organized with the kind of obsessive attention that suggested someone had spent years, maybe decades, compiling this information. But it was the photographs that stopped Ruth cold. An entire filing cabinet drawer was filled with them, not random snapshots, but formal portraits, family pictures, identification photographs. Faces stared out at her from across decades, men in suits, women in elegant dresses, children dressed for special occasions. Behind each photograph, written in that same precise hand, were names, dates, addresses, family connections. The Feldsteins of Vienna, the Rosenberg family of Berlin, the Levis of Amsterdam, the Cohens of Prague, name after name, family after family, hundreds of them. "Walter," Ruth said, her voice breaking, "these are Jewish families. Look at the dates, 1938, 39, 40, 41. These are families from before the Holocaust." Walter came to stand beside her, and together they looked at the faces, at the careful notations, at the documentation of lives that had been lived and then, in most cases, destroyed. The filing cabinets weren't just financial records. They were memorials. They were evidence. They were an archive of people who had been systematically robbed before being systematically murdered. At the far end of the vault, placed almost ceremonially on a wooden desk that looked like it belonged in a banker's private office, was a leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked with age but well-maintained, and the pages inside were filled with handwriting in German. Ruth picked it up with trembling hands. "I can't read German," she said. "But look, there's a note paper-clipped to the first page." The note was written in English in a different hand than the journal itself, shakier, more recent, as if written by an aged person with failing strength. "To whoever finds this vault, If you are reading this note, then I am dead, and my cowardice has finally been inherited by someone else. I do not know if you are a person of honor or a thief, if you will do what is right or what is profitable. I can only hope that God has sent someone worthy to finish what I could not. My name is Heinrich Vogel. I was a banker in Zurich from 1933 until my retirement in 1992. During the darkest years of our history, I witnessed crimes that no decent person should ever have to witness, and I participated in them through my silence and my obedience to orders I should have refused. I have translated the first pages of my journal into English, so that whoever finds this will understand immediately what lies in this vault and what burden they now carry. Read it, understand it, and then, please, do what I lacked the courage to do, make it right. Heinrich Vogel, December 1996. With shaking hands, Ruth turned to the next page, which was covered in the same English handwriting. She began to read aloud, her voice soft in the silence of the vault, and Walter stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, as they learned the story of what they'd found. I was 26 years old when I began working at the Zurich Privatbank in 1933. I was proud to work there. It was a prestigious position for someone of my age and background. Swiss banking was the envy of the world, secure, private, trustworthy. Our clients included some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in Europe. In 1938, everything changed. Not all at once, but gradually, like poison seeping into water. Jewish families began coming to the bank, wealthy families from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia. They were desperate. They knew what was coming. Many of them understood before the rest of us did, and they were trying to save what they could. They brought their wealth to Switzerland because we were neutral, because Swiss banks were safe, because they believed that what they deposited would be protected. We welcomed their money. We opened accounts. We stored their valuables in our vaults. We promised security and confidentiality. And they trusted us because what choice did they have? Then the war came, and then the accounts started closing, not because the clients closed them. Most of our Jewish clients never returned. They were rounded up, sent to camps, murdered. Their accounts sat dormant, full of wealth they would never claim. And my bank, along with many other Swiss banks, made a decision. Not officially, not in writing, but a decision nonetheless. We declared the accounts abandoned. We transferred the assets to the bank's holdings. We erased the records, or we claimed they'd never existed. When survivors came after the war asking about family accounts, we told them there was nothing, no record, no account. Your family must have been mistaken. I watched this happen. I processed some of the paperwork myself. I was just following orders, I told myself. I was just doing my job. I had a wife, a child on the way. I couldn't risk my position. I couldn't speak out against the bank's leadership. What good would it do? One voice against an entire institution? So I said nothing. I did my job, and I hated myself for it. But I kept records. Secretly, at great personal risk, I made copies of accounts that were closed, of assets that were seized, of families whose wealth was stolen a second time after they'd already lost everything else. I documented every theft, every lie, every denial of legitimate claims by survivors and their families. And then, when I was senior enough, when I had access and authority, I began to steal it back. Not all of it. That would have been impossible. But piece by piece, over the course of 40 years, I recovered what I could. Gold that had been deposited by Jewish families and then seized by my bank. I slowly diverted portions of it to personal accounts, then withdrew it and brought it here. Bearer bonds that should have been returned to heirs but were instead claimed by the bank. I found ways to liberate them from our vaults and hide them in mine. Art that had been stored for safekeeping and then sold by the bank when the owners didn't return. I tracked down pieces at auctions and bought them with money I'd earned and saved specifically for that purpose. It took decades. It took every spare franc I had. It took risks that could have landed me in prison or worse. But I couldn't live with myself unless I tried to right some of the wrongs I'd witnessed. The problem was I didn't know what to do with what I recovered. I tried in the early years to return items to families, but the families were gone, dead in camps, scattered across continents, lost to history. I hired private investigators to search for heirs. I placed advertisements in newspapers. I contacted Jewish organizations, but for every family I found, and I found only 3 in 40 years of searching, there were dozens I couldn't locate, and I couldn't go public. I couldn't expose what I'd done, recovering the stolen assets, without exposing how I'd done it, which would have led to investigations not just of me, but of other bank employees who'd helped me over the years. People who'd risked their careers to slip me information, to look the other way, to enable my small acts of restitution. I couldn't betray them, so I kept everything here, in this vault, documented meticulously. Every item corresponds to a file that shows who it belonged to, when it was deposited, what happened to it, and what I know about the family. I have spent my retirement years trying to track down descendants. I have files on hundreds of families. Some I've found, most I haven't. And now I am 83 years old in failing health, and I know I will never finish this work. So I leave it to you, whoever you are, whatever brought you here. In this vault is approximately $260 million in assets, gold, bonds, currency, art, all of it stolen from Jewish families during and after World War II. All of it documented, all of it waiting to be returned to the people it rightfully belongs to. The files contain everything you need: names, account numbers, family histories, research I've compiled on descendants and heirs. Some cases will be straightforward, others will be impossible. But each one deserves an attempt at justice. I know what you're thinking. You could keep this. You could take the gold, sell the art, cash the bonds. You could become wealthy beyond imagination, and no one would ever know. The bank won't come looking. They think these assets are long gone. The families won't come looking. Most of them don't know their ancestors had accounts in Switzerland. You could disappear with this fortune and live like royalty, but you won't. Or at least, I pray you won't. Because if you've gotten this far, if you've read this letter, if you're still here instead of already calling someone to liquidate the contents, then you're the kind of person who understands that some things matter more than money. This vault is not treasure. It is evidence of crimes. It is proof of what was done to innocent people. It is a sacred trust that I failed to fully honor in life, and I'm begging you not to fail it in death. Find the families. Return what was stolen. Tell the truth about what Swiss banks did. Give these people or their descendants what they're owed, not just money, but acknowledgement, recognition that they existed, that they mattered, that they were wronged, and that someone, finally, is trying to make it right. This is the burden I pass to you. I'm sorry for it, but I'm also grateful, because it means someone, finally, will finish what I began. Forgive me for my cowardice, and please, honor those who deserved better than they received. Heinrich Vogel. Ruth stopped reading. The vault was silent except for the faint hum of the dehumidifiers and the sound of her own breathing, ragged with emotion. She closed the journal carefully and set it back on the desk, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. Walter said nothing for a long time. He just stood there, one hand still on Ruth's shoulder, staring at the walls of gold and files and faces of people who'd been dead for 70 years, but whose claims to justice had just become his responsibility. Finally he spoke, his voice rough. "We need to get out of this vault. I can't breathe in here." They climbed back through the opening, back up the stairs, back to the kitchen where normal life existed. Ruth filled the kettle for tea because her hands needed something to do. Walter sat heavily in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 72 years. $260 million, Ruth said, not because she'd forgotten, but because she needed to say it out loud, needed to make it real. Stolen from Jewish families, hidden away for decades. And now it's ours. Not ours to keep, but ours to… what? To fix? To return? To somehow make right? Heinrich spent 40 years trying to find the families, Walter said. 40 years, and he only succeeded with 3. 3 families out of hundreds. How are we supposed to do better? We don't speak German. We don't know anything about international banking or Holocaust research or any of this. Ruth poured the hot water over tea bags, her movements automatic. So what do we do? Call the police? Call the Swiss government? I don't even know who you'd call for something like this. And say what? Walter asked. Hello, we just moved here and discovered that the previous owner had hidden $260 million in stolen Holocaust assets in his basement. Come take it away. Isn't that exactly what we should say? Ruth brought the tea to the table and sat down across from him. Walter, this isn't ours. It never was. It belongs to the families Heinrich documented. We should report it to someone who can do the work of finding them and returning what was taken. To who, though? Walter pressed. Heinrich said the banks are corrupt, that they'll hide what happened, protect themselves. If we hand this over to the Swiss authorities, what's to stop them from making it all disappear? From claiming it for themselves or burying it in bureaucracy until everyone forgets about it? Ruth cupped her hands around her tea mug, seeking warmth against the chill that had settled in her bones. But we can't do this ourselves. We're not qualified. We don't have the resources or the knowledge or the time, Walter finished. No, we don't. Which is why we need to be very careful about who we trust with this. They sat in silence for a while, drinking tea, processing the impossible situation they'd stumbled into. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the Swiss mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful if they'd been in any state to appreciate it. There's a woman in one of these photographs, Ruth said suddenly. A letter attached to her file. I saw it while you were looking at the gold. I didn't read it all, but I saw enough. She stood and walked to the basement door, then stopped. I need to show you. They went back down together, exhaustion making them clumsy. In the vault, Ruth went directly to one of the filing cabinets and pulled out a folder marked Feldstein, Sarah, Case 127. Inside was a photograph of a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, standing with her parents in front of a nice house. All 3 were smiling, dressed nicely, looking prosperous and happy. The photo was dated 1937. Paper-clipped to the photograph was a letter, yellowed with age, written in English on what looked like cheap paper. Ruth read it aloud, her voice shaking. Dear Mr. Vogel, I am writing to you because I have nowhere else to turn, and someone at your bank said you might help when others would not. I hope they were right. I pray they were right. My name is Sarah Feldstein. I was born Sarah Feldstein in Vienna in 1925. This is difficult for me to write, but I must try. Before the war, my father, Jakob Feldstein, had an account at Zurich Privat Bank. Account number 38721-4. He was a jeweler in Vienna, successful. He made beautiful pieces for wealthy clients all over Austria and Germany. He was careful with his money. He was careful with everything. In 1938, after the Anschluss, he knew we needed to leave. But leaving meant abandoning everything. So he took what he could, money, bonds, my mother's jewelry, deeds to properties, and brought it to Switzerland, to your bank. He said Switzerland was neutral. He said Swiss banks were safe. He said no matter what happened, what he put in that account would protect us, would give us a way to start over after the war ended. He showed me the bank book. I was 12 years old. He showed me the account number and made me memorize it. He said, Sarah, if anything happens to us, remember this number. This is our insurance. This is how you'll survive. The Germans took my parents in 1943. I never saw them again. I survived because a family hid me in their home for 2 years. They risked everything for a child they didn't know. They saved my life. After the war, I tried to claim my father's account. I had his documents. I had his passport number. I had the account number memorized just like he taught me. I went to your bank in 1948. They told me there was no account. They said Jakob Feldstein had never been a client. They said I was mistaken. But I am not mistaken, Mr. Vogel. I was 12 years old when my father took me to that bank. I remember the marble floors. I remember the man who showed us to his office. I remember my father's face when he turned to me and said, "This will keep us safe." I have written to your bank 17 times. I have sent them every document I have. They send back form letters saying they have no record of the account and can offer no assistance. I am writing to you because someone told me you are different, that you care about the truth, that you might help me. I don't even want the money anymore. It's been too long. I've built a life in New York. I have a husband, a child. We're getting by. But I need someone to say my father was real, that he existed, that he tried to protect us, that what happened to him was wrong. I need someone to acknowledge that his account was real, that we didn't imagine it, that my parents' last attempt to save me wasn't a delusion or a mistake. Please, Mr. Vogel, please help me. Sarah Feldstein, New York, New York, March 1963. Ruth stopped reading. Attached to Sarah's letter was a note in Heinrich's handwriting. Account 38,721-4. Jakob Feldstein. Account opened April 1938. Initial deposit 87,000 Swiss francs in cash, bonds, and jewelry. Account closed by executive order August 1943 during account holder's absence. All assets transferred to bank holdings. Current estimated value, if properly invested, $11.7 million. Sarah Feldstein denied all claims. Told account never existed. She wrote to me directly in 1963. I helped her recover $50,000 through back channels, all I could manage without exposing what the bank had done. I told her it was a small settlement, that the account had been worth less than records showed. I lied to her to protect myself and my position. She accepted the money. She was grateful, and she never knew I could have gotten her millions if I'd been braver, if I'd exposed the truth. She died in 2006. Her grandson contacted me in 2004 trying to reopen her case. I told him there was nothing more to find. I lied to him too. This is my greatest failure. Sarah Feldstein deserved better. Her father deserved better. Their family deserved the truth. Whoever finds this, make it right. Find Sarah's descendants. Return what was stolen. Tell them their great-grandfather's account was real, that Sarah was right all along, that she wasn't mistaken or deluded. Give them the acknowledgement she spent 60 years begging for. Do what I should have done. Ruth folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the file. Her face was wet with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. Sarah died never knowing the truth, she said. She spent 60 years trying to prove her father existed, trying to get someone to acknowledge that her family mattered. And Heinrich knew. He had all the evidence. He could have helped her, and he didn't. He tried, Walter said quietly. He got her $50,000. It wasn't enough, but he tried. It wasn't enough, Ruth agreed, and he knew it wasn't enough. That's why he wrote all this down. That's why he left it for someone else to finish. She looked at Walter, her eyes fierce despite the tears. We can't let her grandson never know the truth. We can't let Heinrich's cowardice become our cowardice. Walter stood and walked to the filing cabinets. He opened drawer after drawer, seeing file after file, name after name, family after family. Hundreds of them, each one a story like Sarah's. Each one a life stolen, a family destroyed, an account closed, a claim denied. This isn't just about money, he said. It's about proving these people existed, about acknowledging what was done to them, about finally telling the truth. "So we can't just call the authorities," Ruth said. "Not yet. Not until we understand what we have. Not until we know who to trust." Walter nodded slowly. "We document everything ourselves first. We photograph every file, every document, every piece of evidence. We make copies, store them somewhere safe. We make sure that even if something happens to us, the truth doesn't disappear again." "And then?" Ruth asked. "And then we find people we can trust. Holocaust historians, researchers, people whose whole job is finding the truth and making sure it's told. People who won't bury this for political convenience or profit." Ruth looked around the vault, at the walls of gold and the cabinets full of lives, and felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a physical thing. They were 72 and 68 years old. They should be gardening and reading and enjoying quiet retirement. Instead, they were standing in a hidden vault full of stolen wealth and stolen lives, trying to figure out how to do what one man had failed to do in 40 years. "We're too old for this," she said. "Probably," Walter agreed. "But we're not too old to try." They spent the next 3 days doing nothing but documenting. Ruth set up a system, her teacher's organizational skills proving invaluable, cataloging every file, every document, every item. Walter photographed everything with a digital camera they'd brought from America, his contractor's attention to detail ensuring nothing was missed. They discovered that Heinrich had organized everything by family name and case number. Each file contained the family's history, their account information, what had been deposited, what had happened to it, and what Heinrich had been able to learn about descendants and heirs. Some files were thick with research, pages of notes about family members who'd survived, immigration records, addresses, phone numbers. Others were heartbreakingly thin, just a photograph and a note saying, "Entire family lost, no known survivors." The gold bars had tags, noting which account they'd come from. The bearer bonds were catalogued with the original depositor's information. Even the art had detailed provenance notes showing who had owned each piece and how it had come to be in a Swiss bank vault instead of with its rightful owners. "He spent his entire life on this," Ruth said on the third evening, her voice hoarse from reading documents aloud while Walter typed notes on his laptop. "His whole retirement, all his money, everything, trying to make this right." "And he still failed," Walter said. "By his own admission, he failed. Because one person, working alone, can't fight entire institutions, can't overcome systems designed to hide the truth." Ruth looked at him. "So what makes us think we can do better?" "We're not working alone," Walter said. "We're going to find people who've spent their whole careers fighting these battles. People who know how to navigate these systems. People who've dedicated their lives to justice for Holocaust victims." "You have someone in mind?" Ruth asked. Walter pulled up something on his laptop, an article he'd found during his research over the past few days. "There's an organization, Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem. They have a whole department dedicated to recovering stolen assets and finding heirs. And there's a woman who runs it, Dr. Miriam Klein. She's spent 30 years tracking down looted art and stolen accounts." Ruth leaned over to read the article. Dr. Klein had been involved in major cases, forcing Swiss banks to acknowledge accounts they'd denied existed, recovering artwork from museums that had acquired pieces under questionable circumstances, finding heirs to fortunes that had been hidden for decades. "She looks like someone who doesn't give up," Ruth said, studying the photograph of a woman with steel-gray hair and determined eyes. "Neither do we," Walter replied. "Not anymore." That night, lying in the narrow bed in their Swiss mountain house, Ruth said into the darkness, "If we do this, if we contact Dr. Klein, if we expose what Heinrich hid here, our lives are going to change. We bought this house thinking we'd have a quiet retirement. That's over. We're going to become part of something bigger and more complicated and probably more dangerous than two old people should be involved in. "I know," Walter said. "People will come here. Lawyers, investigators, reporters. People who want this hidden. People who want to steal it. People who want to expose it. We'll be in the middle of all of it. I know." "We could still just seal the wall back up," Ruth said. "Pretend we never found it. Live here quietly until we die and let it be someone else's problem." "Could we?" Walter asked. "Could you? Honestly?" Ruth thought about Sarah Feldstein, spending 60 years trying to prove her father existed. She thought about the faces in those photographs, the families who'd lost everything, the accounts that had been denied, the truth that had been buried. She thought about Heinrich Vogel spending his retirement trying to make right what he'd been too afraid to prevent. "No," she said finally. "I couldn't. But I'm terrified." "Me too," Walter admitted. "But maybe being terrified and doing it anyway is what courage actually looks like at 72 years old." They lay in silence for a while, holding hands across the narrow space between their beds. Two elderly people who'd thought they knew what the rest of their lives would look like and had just discovered they'd been completely wrong. Tomorrow, Walter would call Dr. Miriam Klein. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of exposing what Heinrich had hidden. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, in the darkness of their Swiss mountain house with its secret vault and its burden of justice, Walter and Ruth Brennan made a choice that would define not just their remaining years, but the legacy they'd leave behind. They chose not to walk away. They chose not to keep what wasn't theirs. They chose not to let Sarah Feldstein's grandson live his entire life not knowing his great-grandmother had been right all along. They chose honor over ease, truth over comfort, and the burden of doing what was right over the peace of doing nothing. And in making that choice, two ordinary people who'd spent their lives being invisible and unremarkable set in motion something that would shake institutions, expose decades of lies, and prove that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't money or authority or youth. Sometimes it's just two old people deciding that enough is enough, that truth matters, and that some responsibilities are worth accepting even when, especially when, they're terrifying. The vault could stay hidden no longer. The secret was about to become a revelation. And Walter and Ruth Brennan, who'd bought a house for $23,000 and found $260 million worth of stolen justice, were about to discover that the real treasure wasn't what they'd found. It was who they were becoming in deciding what to do with it. The first knock came exactly 12 days after Walter had called Dr. Miriam Klein in Jerusalem. Ruth was in the kitchen, grinding coffee beans by hand, the old-fashioned way she preferred, claiming it tasted better even though Walter suspected it was just habit from a lifetime of doing things the hard way. The sound of the grinder masked the approaching footsteps, so when 3 sharp raps echoed through the stone house, she jumped hard enough to spill beans across the counter. "Walter," she called, keeping her voice steady even as her heart raced. He emerged from the basement where he'd been organizing Heinrich's files for what felt like the 100th time, creating backup systems, making copies of copies, ensuring that if anything happened to the originals, the truth would survive. Dust covered his flannel shirt, and his reading glasses sat crooked on his nose. "Expecting someone?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. They weren't. They were miles from any neighbors. The nearest village was 40 minutes down the mountain. They'd told no one they were here except Dr. Klein, and she'd promised discretion until they could properly secure the vault's contents and begin the formal process of investigation. Walter approached the heavy wooden door cautiously and peered through the small window set into the thick stone. 3 men stood outside, all wearing dark suits despite the morning chill and the remoteness of the location. One held a leather briefcase. Another had his hands in his pockets in a way that looked casual but felt calculated, like a man accustomed to concealing what his hands might be doing. The third was older, perhaps 70, with silver hair, perfectly styled, and the kind of face that had learned to smile without warmth reaching the eyes. Walter opened the door but kept the chain latched, a precaution he'd installed 3 days ago when he'd started feeling watched. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Brennan?" The older man spoke English with barely a trace of accent, the kind of perfect pronunciation that suggested expensive education rather than native fluency. "My name is Victor Rauch. I represent Stern and Associates, a legal firm in Zurich specializing in estate matters and property disputes. May we come in? I believe we have matters to discuss regarding your recent purchase and certain discoveries you may have made." The word discoveries landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. "What discoveries?" Walter asked carefully, his contractor's hands gripping the doorframe to keep them steady. Victor's smile didn't change, but his eyes did. They sharpened, calculating. "Mr. Brennan, may I be frank? You broke through a sealed wall in your basement 8 days ago. You've made multiple trips to the village for supplies. Specifically, archival materials, climate-controlled storage containers, and a rather sophisticated digital scanning system. You've been seen photographing documents. You've installed a security system quite elaborate for what's supposedly a simple retirement cottage. And 4 days ago, you placed an international call to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem that lasted 47 minutes. Ice crawled down Walter's spine. They'd been watching. How long? Since they arrived? Since before? Who were these people and how did they know so much? "I don't know what you're talking about," Walter said, the lie feeling obvious even as he spoke it. "Of course not," Victor replied smoothly. "But perhaps we could discuss it inside. The mountain air is rather cold, and I think this conversation would benefit from privacy. You wouldn't want your neighbors to overhear, after all." "We don't have neighbors," Ruth said, appearing behind Walter. Her voice was steady, her teacher's authority coming through even as her hands trembled slightly. "That's rather the point of living up here, privacy, which you're violating." Victor's attention shifted to her, his smile warming in a way that was somehow more threatening than his coldness had been. "Mrs. Brennan, how lovely to meet you. I understand you were a school teacher. 3rd grade, wasn't it? Such an important age. When children are still impressionable, still learning right from wrong." He paused. "Still learning that some secrets are better kept than shared." The threat was unmistakable, even wrapped in pleasantries. Ruth stepped closer to Walter, her hand finding his arm. She'd spent 36 years managing classroom bullies and passive-aggressive parents and administrators who thought intimidation was leadership. She recognized power plays when she saw them. "I think you should leave," she said, her voice carrying the tone that had once made unruly 8-year-olds straighten in their seats. "This is our property. You're not welcome here." Victor's smile finally faded. One of the younger men, the one with his hands in his pockets, stepped forward slightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, I don't think you understand the situation you've placed yourselves in." "Oh, we understand perfectly," Walter interrupted, finding his own voice, his own strength. "You're lawyers, which means someone sent you, someone who's worried about what we might have found, someone who'd rather we kept quiet about whatever Heinrich Vogel left behind, someone who thinks 2 old Americans are going to be easy to intimidate." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You're making assumptions." "Am I?" Walter asked. "Then tell me, who do you represent? What's your interest in this property? Why are you here?" For a moment no one spoke. Then Victor reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully telegraphing the movement, and pulled out a business card. He held it out toward the gap in the door. "We represent certain financial institutions that have an interest in the proper handling of assets that may have been irregularly obtained by the previous owner of this property. Assets that, if they exist, would have complex legal implications regarding ownership, taxation, and international treaty obligations." "In other words," Ruth said, You represent banks that are worried about what Heinrich documented, about what he saved, about what he knew. Victor's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. Mrs. Brennan, what you may or may not have found in this house is not simply yours to claim or dispose of. There are legal complexities, historical implications, many parties with legitimate interests. If you've discovered something significant, the responsible thing, the legal thing, would be to report it to proper authorities immediately. And you represent these proper authorities? Walter asked. We represent parties who can ensure this matter is handled appropriately, discreetly, without unnecessary complications for anyone involved. Victor paused, letting the implications settle. Including yourselves, you're elderly, far from home, no family nearby, no support network, no understanding of Swiss law or international banking regulations. This could become very difficult for you if you choose to make it so. Is that a threat? Ruth asked, her voice sharp. It's advice, Victor said. From someone who's seen how these situations can escalate, how they can become overwhelming for people who lack the resources to navigate complex legal waters, how they can consume years of your life, years you may not have to spare, in litigation and investigation and scrutiny of your own actions and motivations. He stepped back from the door, straightening his jacket. I'll leave you my card. When you're ready to discuss this matter sensibly, call me. But don't wait too long. Other parties will come. Some of them will be less courteous than we've been today. The three men walked back to their black Mercedes, parked down the dirt road where they'd thought it wouldn't be immediately visible. They didn't leave right away. They sat in the car, talking, looking back at the house, making it clear that this wasn't over, that they'd be watching, that pressure had only begun to be applied. Walter closed and locked the door. His hands were shaking now. Not from fear exactly, but from adrenaline and anger and the sudden realization of what they'd truly stepped into. How did they know? Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We've been so careful. We haven't told anyone except Dr. Klein, and she promised. Someone's watching the house, Walter said. Cameras, maybe, or someone in the village reporting our activities, or they've been monitoring our phone calls. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. Heinrich was right. The banks don't want this exposed. They'll do whatever it takes to bury it again. They spent that afternoon making phone calls, first to Dr. Klein, who was horrified but not surprised. This is what they do, she said, her accent more pronounced in her anger. They intimidate, they threaten, they make people feel isolated and vulnerable until they give up or hand over what they've found. But Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Brennan, you must not give up. What you have is too important. What we have is making us targets, Walter replied. Yes, Dr. Klein agreed. And I'm sorry for that. But you're also heroes. You're protecting evidence that could bring justice to hundreds of families. Please, hold on. I'm arranging for proper authorities to come. Real authorities, not lawyers representing banks. Historians, investigators from international agencies, people who will protect you and the vault's contents. Can you hold on for 48 hours? We'll try, Ruth said. The second knock came that night. This time it was the Swiss police, 2 officers, professional and polite, apologizing for the late hour, but explaining they'd received a report of possible undocumented historical items on the premises. It was routine, they assured Walter and Ruth. Just verification that everything was in order with the estate sale, just a formality. But Walter and Ruth had spent the afternoon preparing for exactly this. They'd hidden the most damaging documents, Heinrich's journal, the files documenting specific bank crimes, the letters from denied claimants, in locked boxes buried at 3 separate locations on their property. GPS coordinates written down and mailed to their son Thomas with instructions to open the envelope only if something happened to them. The vault itself they couldn't hide, nor did they try, but they could control what authorities saw and what remained protected. "Of course, officers," Walter said, opening the door fully this time. "We're happy to cooperate." The police searched the house thoroughly but professionally. They found the vault, of course, impossible to miss once you knew to look. They found the gold, the paintings, the currency, the filing cabinets. They photographed everything, asked questions that Walter and Ruth answered carefully, truthfully, but not completely. Yes, they'd found a sealed room. Yes, they'd opened it out of curiosity. Yes, they were surprised by the contents. No, they hadn't taken anything. No, they hadn't tried to sell anything. Yes, they understood this might be complicated. No, they hadn't known anything about it when they bought the house. Yes, they were planning to report it to proper authorities. In fact, they'd already contacted Yad Vashem. That last detail made one officer pause and exchange glances with his partner. Yad Vashem wasn't just any organization. Mentioning it signaled that Walter and Ruth understood what they'd found, understood its significance, understood that this wasn't just about money, but about history and justice. The officers confiscated Heinrich's journal, the one in German that Walter and Ruth couldn't fully read anyway, having already photographed and translated the key pages. They took several boxes of documents, selected seemingly at random, but probably specifically chosen to remove the most obviously incriminating evidence. They sealed the vault with official tape and warned Walter and Ruth not to disturb anything further. "Someone from the Cultural Heritage Office will be in touch," the senior officer said at the door. "Until then, this is a secure site. Do not enter the vault. Do not remove anything. Do not discuss this with anyone outside official channels." "What if those lawyers come back?" Ruth asked. "The ones who were here this morning?" The officer frowned. "What lawyers?" "Victor Rauch, from Stern and Associates. They wanted to discuss the vault." The two officers exchanged another look, this one harder to read. "Mrs. Brennan," the senior officer said carefully, "I would advise you not to speak with anyone claiming to represent legal interests in this matter until official investigations are complete. There are many people who might claim standing in such a case. Not all of them are legitimate." After they left, Ruth sat down at the kitchen table and started to cry. Not from fear, though she was afraid. Not from stress, though the pressure was immense, but from exhaustion. They were too old for this, too tired, too far from home and help and anything familiar. Walter held her, his own throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. "We could stop," he said quietly. "We could call our kids, get on a plane tomorrow, go back to Pennsylvania. Let someone else deal with all of this." Ruth pulled back, wiping her eyes, and looked at him with an expression he'd seen before. On their wedding day, when they'd had $127 between them and everyone said they were too young. When they'd bought their first house and everyone said they couldn't afford it. When she'd gone back to school for her teaching degree with 3 children under 5 and everyone said it was impossible. "And what happens to Sarah Feldstein's family?" she asked. "What happens to all the families Heinrich documented? Who fights for them if we don't?" "We're not fighters, Ruth. We're a carpenter and a teacher. We're 72 and 68 years old." "No," Ruth said, her voice gaining strength. "We're the people who happened to find this. We're the people Heinrich's journal ended up reaching. We're the people who broke through that wall and learned the truth. And maybe that makes us exactly the right people to see this through." The assault came from multiple directions after that. First, their son Thomas called, frantic. "Dad, there are lawyers at my office. They're asking questions about you and Mom, about the house purchase, about your finances. They're implying you've done something illegal, that you're hiding assets in Switzerland, that you might be involved in some kind of international tax fraud." Then their daughter Margaret, "Mom, someone called my boss. They said you and Dad might be involved in trading stolen property, that you're part of some kind of art theft ring. My boss pulled me aside and asked if I knew what you were really doing in Switzerland. I had to tell him I didn't know anything, which made me look like either a liar or a terrible daughter." Then Rebecca, "There are reporters calling. How do they even have my number? They're asking about Nazi gold and stolen art and whether you two are really just retired or if you're working for some organization. What is happening? Why are you in the middle of this?" Walter and Ruth realized with cold clarity that this was coordinated. Someone, the banks, the lawyers, whoever stood to lose from the truth being exposed, was trying to isolate them, to attack their credibility, to pressure them through their family, to make them so desperate and afraid and overwhelmed that they'd give up and hand over everything and disappear. "We need to tell the kids the truth," Ruth said after the third panicked phone call in as many hours. "They need to understand what we're doing and why." That evening, they set up a video call with all three children, their faces appearing in squares on the laptop screen. Thomas looked exhausted, his tie loosened and his eyes red from stress. Margaret was in her car, having snuck away from her family to have this conversation in privacy. Rebecca was at her kitchen table, her husband visible in the background making dinner and pretending not to listen. "We found something in the house," Walter began. "Something significant. Something that's causing a lot of powerful people a lot of concern." He told them everything about the vault, about Heinrich's journal, about the $260 million in assets stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust, about the documented evidence of Swiss banking crimes, about their decision to contact Yad Vashem rather than simply handing everything over to Swiss authorities who might bury it. The silence when he finished was profound. Then Thomas spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Dad, Mom, you need to get out of there, right now, tonight. Get on a plane and come home before this gets any worse." "We can't do that," Ruth said gently. "Yes, you can," Margaret jumped in. "You absolutely can. You found it. You reported it to someone. You've done your part. Now let the professionals handle it and come home before you get hurt." "Or sued," Thomas added. "Or arrested. Or worse. These aren't small-town property disputes, Dad. You're talking about international banking crimes, about institutions with unlimited resources. They will destroy you if you threaten them." "Then we get destroyed," Walter said quietly. "But we're not walking away." "Why not?" Rebecca asked, and there was genuine anguish in her voice. "Why can't you just let it go? You've spent your whole lives being practical, being sensible, not making waves. Why start now? Why risk everything for people you don't even know, for crimes that happened before you were born, for money that isn't yours?" Ruth leaned toward the screen, her face close enough that they could see every line, every age spot, every mark of her 68 years. "Because if we don't, who will? The banks have been denying these accounts existed for 70 years. The families have been told they're liars or mistaken or delusional. Heinrich spent 40 years trying to make it right and only succeeded 3 times. 3 times out of hundreds of families. If we walk away now, it all disappears again. The evidence gets buried. The truth gets hidden. And people who spent their entire lives fighting for acknowledgement die never knowing they were right." "That's not your responsibility," Thomas said. "Maybe not," Walter agreed, "but it's our choice. We chose to open that wall. We chose to read Heinrich's journal. We chose to learn the truth. And now we're choosing to protect it until the people who deserve justice can receive it." "You could die," Margaret said bluntly. "People have killed for less. You're elderly. You're isolated. You're in a foreign country with no support. If someone wanted to hurt you, to make you disappear, who would even know? Who would even look?" "You would," Ruth said simply. "And you'd tell the truth about why it happened, about what we were protecting, and that truth would be worth more than our safety." What happens next will test everything Walter and Ruth believe about courage, justice, and the price of standing firm when the whole world wants you to bend. The storm intensifies, the threats become real, and 2 elderly people discover that integrity isn't about strength, it's about refusing to compromise, even when you're terrified. Stay tuned to see how they survive what's coming. If you're moved by their courage, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The children begged for another hour. They pleaded, they argued, they tried every appeal to logic and emotion and family obligation they could think of. But Walter and Ruth had made their decision, and nothing would shake it. After the call ended, Ruth and Walter sat in silence for a long time. Then Walter said, "They're right, you know. This could get us killed. People have died for far less than $260 million and evidence that could destroy institutional reputations." "I know," Ruth said.
"And we're making a choice to stay anyway, to keep fighting, to risk everything for people we'll never meet."
"I know that too." Walter took her hand across the table. "Why are we doing this? Really? Is it because it's right? Or because we're old and we've never done anything that mattered, and this is our last chance to be important?" Ruth considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind. "I think it's both," she said finally. "I think it's right. And I think we've spent 70+ years being invisible, and invisible feels a lot like meaningless. Maybe we want to matter. Maybe we want to know that we existed, that we made a difference, that we weren't just background characters in someone else's story." "Is that selfish?" Walter asked. "Maybe," Ruth admitted. "But Heinrich was selfish too, in a way. He kept this secret for 40 years because he was afraid, because he wanted to protect himself and his career and his comfortable life. And he spent those 40 years hating himself for it. We could make the same choice. We could protect ourselves, stay safe, live quietly. But we'd spend whatever time we have left knowing we chose comfort over courage. And I don't want to die knowing that." The threats escalated. Anonymous letters began arriving, slipped under their door in the night. "Leave Switzerland or face consequences. The vault belongs to its rightful owners, not thieves. Old people should know when to mind their business." Some were in English, some in German, all carrying the same message. "Stop asking questions, stop protecting the evidence, give up and go away." Their rental car's tires were slashed one night. The next morning they found the security cameras they'd installed had been spray-painted over. Someone broke into their small storage shed and scattered Heinrich's less important files across the property, a message that they could reach anything, destroy anything if they chose. Walter started sleeping in shifts, keeping watch through the night, jumping at every sound. Ruth took to carrying a heavy flashlight as a weapon, though what she'd do against someone who really wanted to hurt them, she had no idea. Dr. Klein called daily, encouraging them, assuring them that help was coming, that international authorities were taking this seriously, that their courage was making a difference. But she also warned them. The next 48 hours are the most dangerous. Before official investigations begin, before the story becomes too big to suppress, this is when people who want this buried will take action. Please, please be careful. Consider staying in a hotel in Zurich until— "No!" Walter interrupted. "We leave this house. Someone will come in and take what we haven't secured. We leave, and Heinrich's work disappears. We stay." But staying meant sleepless nights and constant vigilance and the wearing knowledge that they were targets. The most sophisticated attack came not through violence, but through law. A lawyer appeared, not Viktor Rauch this time, but someone else, someone with credentials and official documents and a claim that seemed legitimate on its surface. "My client is Heinrich Vogel's nephew," the lawyer explained, standing at their door in a suit that probably cost more than Walter's truck had. "Martin Vogel, Heinrich's only surviving relative. As his heir, Martin has legal standing to claim all assets found on this property, including anything discovered in sealed or hidden spaces. You, as recent purchasers, have no claim to items that predate your ownership. We're prepared to file a restraining order preventing you from accessing the vault or removing any contents until inheritance matters are resolved." "Heinrich had no heirs," Ruth said. "The estate sale documents said no heirs. That's why the property was sold so cheaply." Martin was estranged from Heinrich, the lawyer explained smoothly. They had no contact for 30 years, but estrangement doesn't negate legal inheritance rights under Swiss law. Blood relations take precedence over property transactions when it comes to valuable discoveries on inherited land. This isn't about inheritance, Walter said. This is about preventing the truth from coming out. The truth, the lawyer said, is that you've discovered property belonging to my client's late uncle, property that you have no right to control, investigate, or distribute. The Swiss courts will agree, I assure you. The legal filing came the next day. An injunction preventing Walter and Ruth from accessing the vault, from removing any materials, from contacting potential claimants, from cooperating with international investigators until Swiss courts resolved questions of inheritance and ownership. It was elegant in its simplicity. Tie everything up in legal proceedings that could take years, proceedings that Walter and Ruth would have to fight with resources they didn't have, all while the evidence sat inaccessible and the families remained uninformed. They're going to win, Ruth said that evening, reading the legal documents for the third time, trying to understand language that seemed designed to be incomprehensible. Not because they're right, but because they can afford to wait, and we can't. Because they have lawyers and we have, what, good intentions? We have something better, Walter said. He pulled out his phone and showed her the email he'd just received from Dr. Klein. We have allies. The email contained names, phone numbers, organizations, Holocaust restitution lawyers who worked pro bono, international law experts who specialized in banking crimes, historians who'd spent careers fighting exactly these kinds of suppression efforts, media contacts who understood that this story was too important to let die quietly. All of them offering help, offering to fight alongside two elderly Americans who'd stumbled into something bigger than themselves. We're not alone, Walter said. We never were. We just didn't know it yet. That night, they didn't sleep at all. They spent it on the phone, video calls with Jerusalem and New York and London and Washington. They sent encrypted files, the photographs and scans they'd made before the police came, the copies Heinrich's documentation they'd hidden. They shared passwords to cloud storage accounts containing everything they'd found. They made sure that even if something happened to them, even if they were forced to leave or arrested or worse, the truth was secured in enough places that it couldn't be disappeared. By morning they were exhausted but no longer afraid, or rather still afraid but no longer alone in their fear. When the lawyers come back, Ruth said over coffee as the sun rose over the Swiss mountains, we'll be ready. When the threats come, Walter added, we won't bend. They'd made their choice. They'd chosen to stand firm not because they were strong or powerful or young, but because they were right. Because the truth mattered more than their comfort. Because integrity wasn't about never being afraid, it was about being terrified and standing your ground anyway. Two elderly people in a stone house on a Swiss mountain had become something neither of them had ever imagined being. Warriors. Not with weapons or violence, but with stubborn, unyielding, absolutely uncompromising conviction that some things were worth protecting even at great personal cost. The storm raged around them. But they didn't break. They bent with the wind, adapted to the pressure, found strength in each other and in the rightness of their cause. And slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn, because institutions and banks and powerful interests had forgotten something important. Sometimes the most dangerous opponents aren't the ones with resources or connections or power. Sometimes they're the ones with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Sometimes they're two old people who've spent their lives being pushed around and have finally found something worth pushing back for. And sometimes that's enough. The first family they found took 3 months of painstaking research, cross-referencing Heinrich's files with immigration records, birth certificates, and the digital archives of Holocaust remembrance organizations across the world. Sarah Feldstein's grandson was named David. He was 57 years old, living in Brooklyn, working as a high school history teacher, and he had no idea that his grandmother's 50-year fight to prove her father's bank account existed had been right all along. Dr. Miriam Klein made the initial contact, explaining carefully who she was and why she was calling. Then she handed the phone to Ruth, who stood in their Swiss kitchen with her hands shaking so badly that Walter had to steady the phone for her. "Mr. Feldstein," Ruth began, her voice cracking, "my name is Ruth Brennan. I'm calling because we found something that belonged to your family. Your great-grandfather Jacob had an account at a Swiss bank. Your grandmother Sarah spent decades trying to prove it existed. She was right. She was always right. And we have the documents to prove it." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Ruth thought the connection had dropped. Then she heard a sound like a sob being swallowed, like a man trying to hold together something that was breaking apart. "My grandmother," David finally said, his voice rough, "died when I was 23. She talked about that account my whole childhood. She'd tell me about her father, about the bank with the marble floors, about how she'd tried to prove it was real. My parents thought she was. They said the trauma had confused her memories, that she'd invented the account as a way to make her father's death mean something. I believed them. I stopped asking her about it because I thought I was encouraging a delusion." "It wasn't a delusion," Ruth said, tears streaming down her face. "Your grandmother was telling the truth, and she deserved to know that before she died. I'm so sorry she never did." "How much?" David asked, and Ruth could hear him trying to steady himself, trying to approach this practically because emotions were too overwhelming. "In the account, I mean. How much was there?" Ruth looked at the file in front of her, at Heinrich's careful calculations. "Your great-grandfather deposited 87,000 Swiss francs in 1938. The bank closed the account and seized the assets in 1943. If that money had been properly managed, invested conservatively as it should have been, it would be worth approximately $11.7 million today." The phone clattered like it had been dropped. Then David's voice came back, shattered and raw. "My grandmother died in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens. She worked as a seamstress until she was 73 because she couldn't afford to retire. She lived on Social Security and whatever we could slip her when she wasn't looking. And the whole time, there was $11 million that should have been hers?" "Yes," Ruth said simply, because there was nothing else to say, no way to soften that truth. "They stole her father's life," David said. "And then they stole her dignity by making her spend 60 years being called a liar." "We're going to make it right," Walter said, leaning close to the phone. "We're working with international lawyers and restitution organizations. The process will take time, but the money will be returned to your family, with interest, with acknowledgement, with an official apology from the institutions that denied your grandmother's claims." "I don't want an apology," David said, his voice hardening. "I want my grandmother's name cleared. I want it on record that she was telling the truth, that she wasn't confused or delusional or mistaken. I want everyone who dismissed her to know she was right." "You'll have that," Dr. Klein promised, taking back the phone. "We'll make sure of it." The Feldstein case became the template for all the others. Methodical research, careful documentation, compassionate contact with families who'd often given up hope of ever knowing the truth about their ancestors' losses. Dr. Klein's organization brought in teams of researchers, genealogists, and legal experts. They worked from Heinrich's files but also expanded beyond them, using his documentation as a starting point to uncover even more stolen accounts, more denied claims, more families who'd been told their memories were false. Walter and Ruth's stone house became an unlikely headquarters. Researchers came and went, setting up workstations in what had been bedrooms, using the vault itself as a primary archive. The couple, both in their 70s and not getting any younger, threw themselves into the work with the kind of determination that surprised everyone, including themselves. Ruth, with her teacher's organizational skills, became the keeper of the family files. She created databases tracking each case's progress, each family contacted, each claim filed, each resolution achieved. She read every letter, looked at every photograph, learned every story. She couldn't help the families herself, but she could make sure their stories were told with care and dignity. Walter, meanwhile, dealt with the physical aspects. He fortified the house against the ongoing attempts at intimidation, better locks, stronger doors, security systems that actually worked. He drove researchers to archives, helped carry boxes of documents, made endless pots of coffee, and quietly ensured that everyone working to achieve justice had what they needed to do their jobs. The legal battles were intense and ongoing. The Swiss banks fought every claim, arguing that the evidence was insufficient, that too much time had passed, that modern banking regulations didn't apply retroactively, that Heinrich's documentation was inadmissible because he'd obtained it through questionable means. They filed motion after motion, appeal after appeal, using their vast resources to delay and deflect and discourage. But they were facing something they hadn't anticipated. Families who'd been waiting 70 years for acknowledgement. Families who'd been called liars, who'd been dismissed and denied and told their ancestors had never existed. These families weren't interested in settling quietly. They wanted trials, they wanted public records, they wanted the truth to be told in courtrooms where denials would be exposed and lies would be documented. And slowly, painfully, impossibly, they started winning. The first major settlement came 14 months after Walter and Ruth had opened the vault. A Swiss court ruled that the Feldstein family's claim was legitimate, that the bank had wrongfully seized assets, and that restitution was owed. The bank was ordered to pay $12 million, the estimated value of the account plus 70 years of accumulated interest. The day the verdict came down, Ruth was in the kitchen making bread. She'd taken up baking in the past year, needing something physical to do with her hands during the endless waiting and stress. Walter came in from the basement where he'd been on a video call with Dr. Klein, his face wet with tears. "We won," he said simply. "David Feldstein won. His grandmother was vindicated, officially, in a court of law. Sarah Feldstein was right all along, and now it's on record forever." Ruth sat down heavily, flour dusting her hands and apron. "One down," she said. 237 to go. But that first victory opened floodgates. Other families came forward, emboldened by the Feldstein case. Other lawyers took notice, seeing that Swiss banks could be held accountable despite their decades of denials. Other researchers began examining their own archives, finding connections to Heinrich's documentation, building cases that had once seemed impossible. The work consumed 2 years of Walter and Ruth's lives. 2 years of early mornings and late nights, of emotional phone calls and heartbreaking stories, of small victories and frustrating setbacks. They aged visibly during that time. Walter's hands shook more, his back bent further, his energy faded faster. Ruth's arthritis worsened, her memory showed gaps, her strength diminished. But they kept working. Because they'd made a promise. Not to Heinrich, though he'd asked. Not to the families, though they deserved it. But to themselves. They'd promised that this one time, this one moment in their long, ordinary lives, they'd do something that mattered. They'd stand for something. They'd be counted. The offers for personal compensation came repeatedly and from multiple sources. The Swiss government, eager to resolve the embarrassing scandal, offered them a finder's fee of $5 million. Private organizations offered consulting fees, speaking engagement payments, book deals, documentary rights. They could have become wealthy beyond anything their modest pensions had ever provided. They refused everything. "The money isn't ours," Ruth explained to a reporter who'd traveled to their mountain house seeking an interview. "It never was. Taking any of it, even as payment for our time, would make us no different from the banks that stole it in the first place. We did this because it was right, not because we expected to profit." "But you've spent 2 years working full-time on this," the reporter pressed. "You've used your savings, your retirement. You could have been traveling, enjoying yourselves. Doesn't that deserve compensation?" Walter, sitting beside Ruth on their worn couch, shook his head. We bought a house for $23,000 and discovered $260 million in stolen assets. If we kept even a fraction of that, what would that make us? We'd be thieves, just ones who justified it better than the bankers did. What do you want, then? The reporter asked. What are you getting out of this? Ruth looked at Walter, and something passed between them. Understanding, agreement, the shared knowledge of two people who'd spent 50 years together and needed no words to communicate. Peace, Ruth said simply. We're getting peace. The knowledge that we did the right thing when we could have done the easy thing, that's worth more than money. The interview ran in Der Spiegel, then was picked up by international media. Walter and Ruth's faces appeared in newspapers and on websites across the world. The couple who chose justice over fortune. American retirees expose Swiss banking scandal. The unlikely heroes of Holocaust restitution. They hated the attention. They weren't heroes, they insisted. They'd just done what anyone should do when confronted with injustice. But Dr. Klein, visiting from Jerusalem for what must have been the 20th time, disagreed. Most people wouldn't have opened that wall, she said, sitting at their kitchen table while Ruth served tea and Walter cut into a loaf of bread that had somehow become his signature offering to visitors. They would have felt the weight of that sealed stone and decided some things are better left alone, and even if they had opened it, most people wouldn't have reported what they found. They would have taken the gold, sold it quietly, and disappeared, and even if they had reported it, most people would have accepted compensation for their time and trouble. You did all three of the hard things. That's not normal. That's exceptional. We're not exceptional, Walter protested. We're ordinary people who got old and bought a house. No, Dr. Klein said firmly. You're ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. And because of those choices, 37 families so far have received restitution. 37 families who'd been told for decades that their relatives never had accounts, that their memories were false, that they had no claim to anything. You gave them proof. You gave them justice. You gave them the ability to prove that their ancestors existed and mattered and were stolen from. That's exceptional, whether you accept it or not. By the third year, the pace of the work had slowed. The most straightforward cases had been resolved. What remained were the difficult ones. Families scattered across continents, documentary trails gone cold, descendants who died before claims could be processed. Heinrich had documented these cases too, but with notes like "no known survivors found" or "family line appears extinct" or "further research required." Walter and Ruth were 75 and 71 now. Their children visited more frequently, worried about their parents' declining health and ongoing stress. Thomas came for 2 weeks and was appalled by how thin they'd both become, how exhausted they looked, how the house had become more archive than home. "You need to stop," he said bluntly over dinner. "You've done enough, more than enough. Let other people finish this work." "We will," Ruth assured him. "Soon. But there are still families we might be able to find. Still cases where a little more research might make the difference between justice and continued denial." "At what cost?" Thomas asked. "Dad looks like he's aged 10 years. You're barely sleeping. You've spent your savings on this house and on supporting researchers. What happens when you run out of money? When you run out of health? What happens to you?" "We die," Walter said simply. "Same as everyone. Same as we would have anyway. But we die having done something worthwhile. Is that so terrible?" Thomas had no answer for that. The decision to convert the vault into a memorial museum came from an unexpected source, David Feldstein. He'd visited several times during the restitution process, needing to see the place where his grandmother's truth had been preserved, needing to understand the story of Heinrich Vogel and Walter and Ruth Brennan. On his 4th visit, standing in the empty vault, most of the assets had been removed, distributed, returned to families, or held in trust for descendants not yet located. He turned to Ruth and said, "This place saved my grandmother's legacy. It should save others too. Not just the families whose assets were here, but anyone who needs to remember that the truth matters. That denied claims and dismissed voices can still be vindicated if someone cares enough to look. The idea took root. With funding from restitution organizations and donations from families who'd received settlements, the vault was transformed. Display cases now held copies of Heinrich's documentation. The originals were in secure archives, but reproductions showed his meticulous record-keeping, his decades of secret justice-seeking, his ultimate courage in documenting what he couldn't single-handedly resolve. Photographs of the families lined the walls, not just names and numbers, but faces. People smiling at weddings, holding children, standing proudly in front of businesses they'd built. People who'd been reduced to account numbers and denied claims, now restored to their full humanity. Each photograph was accompanied by a card telling their story. What they'd lost, what had been denied, what had eventually been returned, what had taken 70 years to acknowledge. And in the center of the vault, on the desk where Heinrich's journal had once sat, was a new display. 3 photographs. Heinrich Vogel, stern and dignified. Walter and Ruth Brennan, elderly and smiling. And below them, a plaque. Heinrich Vogel, 1913 to 1997, spent 40 years documenting injustice he felt powerless to correct. Walter and Ruth Brennan, born 1951 and 1955, spent their retirement ensuring his documentation achieved its purpose. Together they proved that it's never too late for truth, never too late for justice, never too late for ordinary people to do extraordinary things. This vault held $260 million in stolen assets. But its greatest treasure was always the evidence of courage. Heinrich's courage to document, Walter and Ruth's courage to expose, and the courage of every family who refused to stop believing their ancestors' stories mattered. The museum opened quietly on a cold November morning. No grand ceremony, no politicians cutting ribbons, just families gathering, researchers acknowledging their work complete, and 2 elderly Americans standing in the doorway of their home watching strangers walk through with tears and recognition and quiet gratitude. "We did it," Ruth whispered to Walter, leaning against him for support because her legs weren't as steady as they'd once been. "We did," Walter agreed. "Or at least, we did what we could. Heinrich started it. We continued it. Others will finish it." They were right about that. The research continued without them, now based at universities and remembrance centers, but still using Heinrich's documentation as a foundation. Cases were still being resolved. Families were still being found. Truth was still overcoming decades of denial, slowly but inexorably. Walter and Ruth stepped back from active involvement, their health and energy no longer equal to the demands. But they didn't leave their mountain house. They'd grown to love it, not for what they'd found beneath it, but for what it had become. A symbol, a reminder, a place where justice had been chosen over profit and truth over convenience. They restored the house itself using what remained of their savings, fixed the roof properly, updated the ancient plumbing, repaired stone that had crumbled over 2 centuries, not to make it modern or luxurious, but to honor its bones, to respect its age, to ensure it would stand for another century carrying the story of what had happened here. Ruth planted a garden on the hillside, roses and lavender and herbs that could survive the mountain climate. She said she needed something living to tend after years of dealing with documents and deaths and stories of people long gone. Walter built her raised beds and a small greenhouse, his carpenter's hands still capable even if they shook now, even if the work took longer than it once had. They lived simply, cooking meals together, reading by the fireplace, walking the mountain paths when weather and health permitted, taking tea on their small terrace overlooking the valley, watching seasons change and years pass and life continue in its quiet, inexorable way. Visitors came, families who'd received restitution, wanting to thank them. Researchers writing dissertations on Holocaust asset recovery. Students studying history and ethics and the responsibility of ordinary people in the face of extraordinary injustice. School groups touring the memorial vault. Walter and Ruth welcomed them all, made tea and offered bread and answered questions and told the story over and over. Not about themselves, but about Heinrich, about the families, about why truth mattered, and justice couldn't be bound by statute of limitations. One afternoon, 5 years after they'd opened the vault, an elderly woman arrived at their door. She must have been 90, perhaps older, walking with a cane and accompanied by what appeared to be her daughter and granddaughter, 3 generations standing on the stone step. "Mrs. Brennan," the elderly woman said, "my name is Miriam Cohen. My family was one of the ones you found. You recovered my father's account. You gave us proof that he'd tried to save us. You gave me the ability to tell my grandchildren that their great-grandfather was a good man who'd been robbed, not a fool who'd lost everything through carelessness." Ruth invited them in, her hands shaking as she put on the kettle. The woman's daughter explained that they'd flown from Tel Aviv specifically to visit this place, to see where their family's truth had been preserved. "We received $3.7 million, Miriam said, sitting in Ruth's kitchen, her old hands wrapped around a teacup. "That's what my father's account was worth. We divided it among his descendants. There are 17 of us. But the money isn't why I came." She reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph, yellowed and cracked, of a man and woman with 3 small children. "This is my family. 1937. I'm the little one in the middle. My brothers died in the camps. My parents died. I survived because I was hidden. And after the war I tried to tell people about my father's account, about how careful he'd been, how he'd protected us, and they called me a liar, or mistaken, or traumatized into creating false memories." Her voice broke. "For 70 years I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the trauma had confused me. Maybe my memories weren't real." "They were real," Ruth said fiercely. "Your father's account existed. He did protect you. Your memories were true." "I know that now," Miriam said, "because of you. Because you opened that wall and protected those files and refused to let the truth stay buried. You gave me back my sanity. You gave me proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't delusional, wasn't making things up. You let me spend my final years knowing that my father did exist, did try to save us, did matter." She stood, steadier now, and embraced Ruth. 2 elderly women, connected across history and tragedy, and the stubborn insistence that truth mattered, that denials could be overcome, that justice might be slow but wasn't impossible. After they left, Ruth sat at the kitchen table and cried, not from sadness but from something deeper: fulfillment, purpose, the bone-deep satisfaction of knowing that her life, ordinary as it had been, had touched someone else's in a way that mattered. Walter found her there and sat beside her, taking her hand. They didn't need to speak. They'd been married long enough that silence carried more meaning than words. They were 78 and 74 when Walter died. Heart attack, sudden, the doctors said. Quick, at least. No suffering. Ruth was holding his hand, the way she'd held it across kitchen tables and in hospital rooms and walking up mountain paths for over 50 years. His funeral was attended by hundreds, their children, of course, researchers they'd worked with, families they'd helped. David Feldstein flew in from New York. Miriam Cohen sent a letter that Rebecca read aloud. He was a righteous man who chose difficult truth over easy comfort. May his memory be a blessing. Dr. Klein gave the eulogy. She spoke about courage, about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, about how Walter Brennan had been a carpenter who'd built more than houses. He'd built a foundation for justice that would outlast him. Ruth lived 3 more years. She stayed in the mountain house, tending her garden, welcoming visitors, telling Walter's story alongside her own. Her children wanted her to move closer to them, to live somewhere with better medical care and more support, but she refused. "I'm staying," she said simply. "This is where we did the work. This is where Walter's story lives. I'm not leaving it." She died peacefully in her sleep one spring morning, the valley below filled with wildflowers and the mountains standing eternal watch. She was 77 years old. She'd spent the last decade of her life fighting for people she'd never met, protecting truth she'd stumbled upon by accident, proving that retirement could be the most important chapter of all. Her funeral was smaller than Walter's, but no less meaningful. The memorial vault held a special viewing that day, and visitors left flowers and notes and quiet acknowledgments of what she and Walter had accomplished. Years later, their grandchildren would visit the house, now maintained by the Memorial Foundation as part of the museum complex. They'd walk through the vault, seeing their grandparents' photographs on the wall, reading the stories of families helped and justice achieved. They were just ordinary people, one grandchild would say, struggling to reconcile the elderly couple she'd known with the heroes memorialized here. No, Rebecca would correct gently. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. That's not the same thing. They could have kept the gold. They could have walked away. They could have taken the easy path. But they didn't. They chose the hard thing because it was the right thing. And that choice, that integrity, that's what makes someone extraordinary. The story of Walter and Ruth Brennan became part of Holocaust education curricula around the world. Not as heroes swooping in to save the day, but as ordinary retirees who stumbled into injustice and chose to address it rather than ignore it, who spent their retirement not in comfort but in service, who proved that it's never too late to stand for something, never too late to choose truth over convenience, never too late to matter. The house still stands on its Swiss mountainside. The vault still holds its memorial. And carved into the stone above the entrance, added years after Ruth's death, are words from Heinrich's journal that Walter and Ruth had made their own. Some things matter more than safety. Some truths demand to be told. Some responsibilities, once accepted, define who we truly are. Below that, a final addendum. Walter and Ruth Brennan bought this house for $23,000 and discovered $260 million in stolen justice. They kept nothing but their integrity. They gained everything that truly matters. May we all be so wealthy. Because in the end, that was the lesson. Not that finding treasure makes you rich, but that choosing integrity over fortune, truth over comfort, and justice over ease, that was the real treasure all along. Two ordinary people, one extraordinary choice, a legacy that proved the greatest wealth isn't what you keep, but what you give away. Not what you find, but what you do with it. Not the years you live, but how you live them. Walter and Ruth Brennan were never rich. But they died knowing they'd mattered. They'd made a difference. They'd chosen right over easy. And they'd proven that ordinary people at any age can still change the world. Not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the quiet, stubborn, absolutely uncompromising decision to do what's right simply because it's right. And sometimes that's the only kind of treasure that truly lasts. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories that will move you. Click now to continue the journey, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that courage, integrity, and doing what's right matter more than any fortune ever could.